This video is a supplement to Lesson 3 of the Basics Correspondence course. The first video for Lesson 3 showed how to measure gauge for garter stitch. This video is just going to show you how to mark the swatches. This is a stockinette swatch, and you probably can't see that all that clearly, but I have marked the bottom, and I've marked the row. I've placed my waste yarn in the row below the row I want to start measuring. So when I measure, I'm going to measure for the row above this mark. And I have indicated that the bind-off edge is not to be included, and I will measure up to the row below my waste yarn. Now on the side, what I have done is I have marked off my selvage stitches. And I have marked for the first thing that I can clearly identify as a stitch. And remember that a stitch looks like a V. And I'll put that a little closer so maybe you can see. Yeah, you can see that I have that right at the first thing that I can see as a V. You don't want to include your selvage stitches because selvage stitches are not the same width or the same height as regular stitches. Now the other swatch that you measure in this lesson is seed stitch. And seed stitch is a little easier to see. I have marked off my selvages, and the stitches are really quite easy to see. You can see that there's a clear demarcation. And I have marked off my rows below the bind-off edge and above the cast-on edge. Now, like garter stitch, seed stitch is pretty easy to count. What you do is you count the bumps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And I double that. So I have 32 rows in this. Because what I am including, I didn't count the little indents above and below the bumps because those are the other parts of the rows, but counting the bumps helps me count the rows. And the columns are quite easy to count for seed stitch, or the number of stitches. Now the other swatch that we have in the basics class is lace. And this is kind of a trick question because normally if I were doing lace, what I would do is I would work a border on either side. But because there is not a border here, this doesn't give you much choice but to measure the entire width. Whoops, that was millimeters. And this is pretty close to 5 inches. Now the width of lace, because of the nature of lace and the yarn overs, you have a bit more leeway with lace. You can kind of play with blocking it to make it a little bit larger or smaller. So it's not quite as unforgiving as other fabrics. But again, if I were doing this in real life, I would work a border around it and then measure it. Now to count the rows, what you want to do when you work with lace or cables is to keep track of the number of rows you work and the number of stitches that you have cast on, because it's a lot easier to try and do that than to look at a lace pattern and count the stitches. If you do have to count the stitches, start on the first row. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so on, before the decreases and the yarn overs begin. Now the final swatch in the lesson is cable. And there are a couple of ways to approach cable. You would never want to include any kind of border. And I have a stockinette border on this swatch. What I want to do is to think about the actual stitch pattern that is going to be used in the garment. And it would be this. Now, to be more precise, I would include my garter stitch here, my cable, my garter stitch, and then my other cable. That would be the part that I'm actually going to be repeating in that garment. But if I included these two garter stitch, it wouldn't be the end of the world. But I do not want to include the stockinette. Also, I want to measure this in the middle because this part right here, not the flare at the top and the bottom, more accurately represent what's going to be going on in my garment, and I'll get a better representation. I don't want to include the top or the bottom border either. I want to measure from where the cable starts, and cables make it kind of tricky, but I can start measuring from there. And that is how you should be marking these things for the basics class.